One submarine, one harbor. One night that Black Sea Fleet Command will never stop trying to explain. The vessel was tied at the pier, moored inside a fortified naval base that Russian military planners had spent months calling impenetrable. Boom nets stretched across the harbor entrance. Coastal radar swept the water in overlapping arcs. Armed patrol craft circled the outer approach zones. Attack helicopters sat on standby at a nearby airfield, fueled and ready to respond to any surface contact within minutes. The Submarine, a Project 636, 3 Varshavianka, NATO designation improved Kilo, carried Kaliber cruise missiles capable of striking targets hundreds of kilometers inland. It wasn't just a warship. It was a strategic instrument. A floating argument that Russia still controlled the Black Sea and could reach across Ukrainian territory with precision fire whenever it chose. Moscow called Novorossiysk its safest naval berth, after the losses in Sevastopol. After the Moskva, the Rostov-on-Don, the Minsk. The Black Sea Fleet had retreated eastward, redistributing its remaining assets to ports farther from Ukrainian drone corridors. Novorossiysk was the anchor of that strategy, deep inside Russian territory, far from Ukrainian-held coastline, protected by geography, infrastructure, and the simple logic of distance. That logic died in the dark. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down one of the most audacious naval strike operations of the entire conflict, the Sea Baby drone raid on Novorossiysk that put a Kilo-class submarine on the bottom of its own harbor. The question every analyst asked afterward wasn't just how the drones got through. It was how Ukrainian operators managed to thread unmanned surface vessels through layered harbor defenses, avoid detection long enough to close to attack range, and strike a hardened target in a port that Black Sea Fleet Command genuinely believed was beyond reach. The answer involves months of reconnaissance, a specific vulnerability in boom net geometry, and a command decision made at the worst possible moment by the officer responsible for harbor security. We're going to trace every step. To understand the strike, you first need to understand what a Project 636, 3 Varshavianka actually represents in the Black Sea context. This is a diesel-electric submarine built for shallow littoral water operations, 63 meters long, crew of 52. Maximum submerged displacement around 3,000 tons. It carries torpedoes and, crucially, Kaliber cruise missiles. The 3M14 variant has a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers, meaning a single submerged Kilo can reach targets anywhere in Ukraine, strike, and return to depth before a surface response is even organized. Russia used exactly this capability in the early phases of the full-scale war. Kilo submarines fired Kaliber salvos at Ukrainian cities, at infrastructure, at military installations far from the front. Each submarine sortie was a strategic event, not just a tactical one. Losing one didn't just reduce Russia's torpedo count. It degraded the country's ability to hold all of Ukraine at risk simultaneously. Every Kilo that survived was a card Moscow could play in any future escalation. Every Kilo that sank was gone permanently. Ukrainian planners understood this arithmetic perfectly. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? A. The sea drones themselves. B. The intelligence that identified the gap in the boom net. C. The decision by Russian harbor security to reduce patrol density that night. Comment your answer below. The Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, had been building a reconnaissance picture of Novorossiysk naval base for a long time before the strike night. This wasn't improvised. It wasn't a lucky opportunity. It was a target that Ukrainian intelligence had been developing methodically, the way a surgeon prepares for a procedure rather than the way a soldier charges a position. Satellite imagery was the foundation. Commercial providers whose data Ukrainian analysts had learned to aggregate and cross-reference gave periodic snapshots of the harbor. Stacked over time, those snapshots revealed patterns, which berths were occupied on which days, when the Kilo was present versus when it sortied for training, the timing of patrol craft rotations, the approximate coverage arcs of coastal radar installations inferred from where patrol vessels changed their own navigation behavior, because patrol crews knew the radar shadows and exploited them to reduce their workload. The boom nets were the central problem. Every harbor entrance has them, floating barriers designed to stop an underwater or surface approach. Novorossiysk had multiple net barriers protecting the inner basin where the submarine berths were located. Getting through them wasn't a question of speed or stealth alone. It was a question of geometry. A boom net doesn't have to be continuous to be effective. It just has to cover the approaches that a realistic attacker would use. The gaps exist, but they exist in locations defenders consider low risk. Ukrainian engineers and operators spent months modeling the specific gap geometry at Novorossiysk. The information came from multiple sources: satellite imagery at different tidal conditions, open-source harbor charts, signals intelligence on patrol craft communications, and, according to Ukrainian intelligence community sources, human assets with access to harbor maintenance schedules. The critical vulnerability they identified was a gap in the secondary net barrier on the northeastern approach sector. The gap wasn't large, approximately 12 meters of open water between two net segments. It existed for a practical reason. Harbor tugs and supply vessels needed to transit to a secondary pier area, and the net configuration had been designed to allow that with minimal disruption. The patrol craft assigned to monitor that sector had a rotation schedule that created a window of approximately 22 minutes between passes. 22 minutes, 12 meters of gap, 300 meters of open water to cross after getting through. Ukrainian planners built their attack around that window. Stay with me, because what happens in the next section reveals how the operators executed this approach in real time and why the Russian response failed at every critical junction. The unmanned surface vessels used in this operation were the maritime drone variant that Ukrainian forces have developed and refined over the course of the conflict. Low-profile craft with hull designs that minimize radar cross-section, equipped with cameras and sensors feeding a live data stream back to operators potentially hundreds of kilometers away. The specific configuration for the Novorossiysk raid involved multiple vessels operating in a coordinated pattern, with primary strike assets and decoy units in the mix. The operational range for Ukrainian maritime drones of this type exceeds 800 kilometers when optimized for fuel load. Novorossiysk sits approximately 350 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled coastline at the closest approach, well within that envelope. The drones were launched from a pre-positioned location, their navigation handled through a combination of GPS and inertial guidance with operator override capability through encrypted data link. The approach routing was designed to keep the drones in sea states and water temperatures that would degrade Russian coastal radar's ability to detect small surface contacts. The Black Sea has specific thermal layer characteristics at different seasons that affect how radar energy reflects off the water surface. Ukrainian technical teams had factored this into their route planning. The drones came in during a period when surface clutter conditions were favorable, meaning radar operators at Novorossiysk would be seeing more noise in their displays, making it harder to distinguish a small, legitimate contact from background return. How many vessels participated in the actual strike package? A, 4, B, 6, C, 9. The answer is at the end of this video. 3 decoy drones went in first. Their job was not to reach the inner harbor. Their job was to activate the Russian response, to draw patrol craft outward, to trigger alert protocols that would pull defenders away from the sectors that mattered. This is a standard penetration technique adapted for the maritime domain. Create noise at the perimeter so the actual threat can move inside while attention is directed outward. The decoys worked almost exactly as planned. Russian patrol craft responded to contacts detected on the outer approach, moving to intercept. Coastal artillery and shore-based weapon systems shifted their tracking toward the outer harbor mouth. The alert was triggered, but in the wrong direction. The strike drones were already inside the secondary net barrier. They had threaded the 12-meter gap during the 22-minute window between patrol passes. The operators watching the live feed from the onboard cameras later described the transit as the most tense 8 minutes of the entire operation. The gap was navigable, but not comfortable. The drones had to adjust heading multiple times based on minor current variations, and at one point, the lead vessel came within approximately 2 meters of the net barrier itself before the operator corrected. 2 meters. That's how close the entire operation came to ending at the barrier rather than at the submarine berth. The inner harbor opened up once they were through. The cameras showed pier lights reflecting off the water. Alongside the pier, the dark shape of the Varshavianka was clearly visible. Moored, stationary, her crew below decks or at reduced watch. The submarine showed no particular alert status. No additional deck watch was visible on the feed. The routine had not been disrupted. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this operation is a case study in everything traditional naval doctrine failed to account for. The strike drones closed to engagement range. The operators held their approach speed down deliberately. Slower movement meant less visible wake, less radar return, less noise signature. The distance from the inner harbor entrance to the submarine berth was approximately 320 meters. At the approach speed used, that transit took close to 4 minutes. 4 minutes of operators watching a live feed, adjusting course corrections, knowing that if a patrol vessel turned back early, or if a shore watch spotted the wake pattern on the water, the whole operation ended in failure. The Russian harbor security officer responsible for the inner basin had made a decision earlier that evening that would define his career. Facing a scheduled maintenance period for one of the inner patrol craft, he chose not to request a replacement for the evening patrol rotation. The decision was logged in the duty watch record. His reasoning, as later reconstructed from the record, was that the outer harbor patrol was at full strength and the threat assessment for the evening was categorized as low. He signed off on the reduced coverage and went back to his other administrative tasks. This wasn't incompetence in isolation. It was the result of a pattern. For weeks before the strike, nothing had happened. The threat assessments had been low repeatedly. The harbor routine had been quiet. Russian security organizations, like security organizations everywhere, are vulnerable to what analysts call threat normalization, the tendency to rate risk downward when nothing bad has happened recently. The absence of previous attacks didn't mean the threat wasn't building. It meant the threat was being built carefully enough not to trigger early warning. If you believe tactics win wars, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Because this operation proves that preparation, patience, and technical innovation defeat mass and firepower every time. The strike drones reached their designated engagement positions at approximately 340 meters from the submarine's midship section. The attack profile called for impact below the waterline. Maximum structural damage, minimum opportunity for damage control response. The warhead configurations on these maritime drones are designed for exactly this application. Shaped charges optimized to breach hull plating and create flooding that damage control teams cannot address in the time available at a pier without dry dock access. The first detonation came against the submarine's port side, approximately 4 meters below the waterline. The crew felt it before they heard it. A sharp pressure wave transmitted through the hull, strong enough to knock personnel off their feet in the forward compartments. Lighting in multiple sections went out simultaneously. Emergency lighting activated. The duty watch officer's first instinct was not that they were under attack. His first instinct was that something had failed internally. Electrical fault. A battery compartment event. The kind of onboard emergency that submarine crews train for constantly. That instinct cost approximately 40 seconds of organized damage control response. The second detonation came 11 seconds after the first, slightly after the first impact point. Personnel on the pier felt this one as well as the crew below decks. Shore personnel later described a visible shudder in the moored submarine's hull, followed immediately by what they described as a sound like metal tearing underwater. The characteristic noise of hull plating failing under hydrostatic pressure as flooding began. The third drone in the strike package impacted near the submarine's stern. This detonation caught the propulsion section, damaging the propeller shaft seal in addition to breaching the hull. Water was now entering through multiple points. Damage control teams from the crew began responding approximately 90 seconds after the first impact. By that point, the flooding rate in the affected compartments had already exceeded what a crew operating at pier without external pumping assistance could address. The emergency dewatering pumps came online, but they were working against an inflow rate that had not been anticipated in the pier damage control protocols. The submarine began listing to port within approximately 4 minutes of the first impact. Secondary fires broke out along the pier where fuel lines connected to shoreside power and auxiliary systems had been damaged by the shock. The fires were visible from the harbor perimeter and from positions several kilometers away. They burned orange and white against the dark harbor water, reflecting off the surface in a way that made the scene look. According to one OSINT researcher who later reviewed the visual documentation, like a smaller but equally intense version of what Sevastopol had looked like after previous Ukrainian strikes. Shore-based fire response and damage control teams reached the pier within approximately 6 minutes of the first alert being upgraded from the outer harbor response. They found a situation already beyond containment at the pier. The submarine's list had progressed to approximately 12 degrees by the time the first damage control team was on the pier with equipment. What would NATO have done differently in terms of harbor defense? Comment your tactical analysis below. We want to know what you think the correct countermeasures were. The Russian response at the command level failed in a specific and instructive way. The harbor security duty officer, upon receiving the first reports of detonations at the submarine berth, initially directed the outer harbor patrol craft to maintain their positions dealing with the decoy contacts. His situational awareness was fractured. He was receiving reports from 2 locations simultaneously and interpreted them as 2 parts of the same attack rather than as a diversion and a main effort. This assessment held for approximately 4 minutes before the magnitude of the damage to the submarine made it clear that the inner harbor was the primary target. 4 minutes is a long time when a hull is flooding. By the time the patrol craft were redirected toward the inner harbor, the strike drones had completed their attack runs and were already withdrawing on pre-programmed egress routes. There was nothing left to intercept. The weapon had done its work and departed. The only thing the redirected patrol craft found at the submarine berth was their own vessel, listing, burning along the pier, with damage control teams working a losing battle against the flooding rate. This is the moment, right here, at the peak of the chaos, where the operation crossed from tactical success to strategic consequence. Because what happened next at the command level in Moscow wasn't just frustration or embarrassment. It was a calculation about what the loss of this specific submarine meant for the Black Sea Fleet's remaining offensive capability. The Varshavianka that sank in Novorossiysk harbor carried, according to Ukrainian intelligence assessments, Kaliber cruise missiles in its weapon load configuration at the time of the strike. Submarines at pier with loaded weapons are unusual. Standard procedure is to offload munitions before maintenance periods and load before operational sorties. The fact that this vessel had weapons aboard when it was struck suggests it may have been preparing for a sortie, or had recently returned from one without completing the offload cycle. The Kaliber missiles aboard were not recovered intact. The flooding and subsequent fire damage to the munitions compartment, combined with emergency decisions about controlled flooding of certain compartments to prevent fires from reaching other weapons aboard, resulted in the missiles being rendered unrecoverable. 8 Kaliber missiles, based on a standard load for this class, were effectively removed from Russia's operational inventory along with the submarine itself. The financial arithmetic is sobering. A Project 636, 3 submarine costs somewhere between $350 million and $500 million at current market rates, depending on weapons, load, and equipment configuration. The Kaliber missiles aboard, at production cost per unit, add another $40 to $60 million. Total loss in a single night's operation. Somewhere between $400 and $560 million in strategic assets, delivered by unmanned surface vessels that cost a fraction of that sum to build and operate. Ukrainian drone technology in the maritime domain has consistently demonstrated this economic leverage ratio. The Sea Baby platform and its variants are not precision luxury weapons. They are purpose-built asymmetric tools designed to apply force that costs $1 for every $20 or $50 or $100 of damage they cause, against an adversary with finite industrial capacity already under pressure from sanctions and attrition that math compounds over time in ways that traditional force-on-force analysis fails to capture. The satellite imagery that emerged in the days following the strike confirmed what drone operator reports and intercepted Russian communications had already suggested. The submarine was on the bottom of the harbor, or close to it, hull resting on the harbor floor with portions of the superstructure still above the waterline at low tide. Salvage operations were visible in subsequent imagery. Heavy lift crane vessels were brought in. Cofferdam equipment was positioned around the hull. The kilo was not going to be repaired at Novorossiysk. The base didn't have the dry dock infrastructure required for hull repairs of that magnitude. It would need to be raised, a complex and expensive salvage operation in itself, and then transported to a facility with appropriate repair capability. The nearest such facility on the Black Sea coast with the necessary equipment was not close, and that facility was already operating under strain from previous losses and maintenance requirements across the fleet. Russian military bloggers and naval analysts in the independent Russian media, the OSINT community that operates in the gray space between official silence and suppressed truth, described the loss with a combination of fury and resignation that Ukrainian analysts found highly informative. The unofficial assessments were far more honest than anything coming from official channels. Several prominent voices explicitly noted that the Novorossiysk harbor defenses had been described as impenetrable, and that the strike had demonstrated no fixed installation could be considered beyond the reach of Ukrainian maritime drones regardless of the defensive measures in place. That acknowledgement, from within Russia's own informal military analytical community, was itself a kind of victory for Ukraine's strategic information operations surrounding the strike. The intercepted communications from Black Sea Fleet Command in the hours after the strike, as reported by Ukrainian intelligence summaries, showed a pattern that had become familiar from previous Black Sea Fleet losses. Initial confusion, contradictory reporting, attempts to minimize the severity of the damage in reports to higher command, and then, as satellite imagery made concealment impossible, a shift to defensive justification. The harbor security officer who had authorized the reduced patrol rotation was, according to Ukrainian intelligence sources, placed under military investigation within 48 hours of the strike. He was not the only one. The command structure at Novorossiysk base was subjected to a review that extended upward through multiple levels. The question being asked was not just how the drones got through on that night. The question was how the threat assessment had been allowed to drop to the level where a reduced patrol rotation seemed reasonable on a night when a submarine with weapons aboard was moored in the inner harbor. There were no good answers. The threat had been misjudged, and the misjudgment had cost a strategic asset. Do you think Russia will ever fully understand what happened that night? Comment why yes or no. Because based on their previous responses to Black Sea Fleet losses, there's a real argument that the institutional lessons are simply not being absorbed. The broader implications of the Novorossiysk strike extend beyond the loss of a single submarine. They extend to how Russia now has to think about the security of every port facility within range of Ukrainian maritime drones, which, given the demonstrated range of the Sea Baby platform, now includes virtually every significant port on the Black Sea coast that Russia controls or could use. Port Kavkaz, Temryuk, the Kerch approaches. Every facility that the Black Sea Fleet might use as an alternative to Sevastopol, which Ukraine had already made untenable, is now within reach. The strategic benefit of the eastward redistribution of fleet assets, which seemed logical after Sevastopol became too dangerous, has been substantially degraded by the demonstrated capability of Ukrainian maritime drones to operate at extended range. Russia's response has been to invest heavily in additional anti-drone measures at all Black Sea Fleet facilities. Acoustic detection systems, improved radar integration tuned specifically for small surface contacts, additional boom net layers with reduced gap dimensions, dedicated counter-drone patrol craft assigned to harbor security rather than general patrol duties. These investments are expensive. They consume resources. They require manning, maintenance, and operational attention. Every ruble and every hour spent defending harbor facilities from maritime drones is a ruble and an hour not spent on offensive operations. This is the second-order effect that Ukrainian planners engineered for. Not just the destruction of the submarine, but the forcing function on Russian resource allocation that follows from demonstrating the harbor defense vulnerability. This is the logic that UkraineRadar returns to every time we analyze one of these deep strike operations. The weapon matters. The tactics matter. But the strategic compounding effect of making your adversary spend resources on defense is often more consequential than the immediate tactical result. Real tactics. Real consequences. UkraineRadar. The GUR operators who ran the remote piloting stations for this strike, working from positions far from the Black Sea, watching live feeds from cameras mounted on vessels threading through a hostile harbor, demonstrated a capability that navies around the world are now studying. Small boats, cheap technology, encrypted data links, patient reconnaissance. The combination defeated a defense that cost orders of magnitude more to build and man. In the operational review that Ukrainian intelligence and naval planners conducted after the strike, several lessons were documented for internal use and subsequently discussed in public forums by Ukrainian officials. The first was that boom net geometry is always a vulnerability if the attacker has sufficient time to study it. There is no net configuration that eliminates all gaps. The question is always whether the attacker can identify the gap, time the patrol cycles, and execute a transit before being detected. At Novorossiysk, all three conditions were met. The second lesson was that decoy operations remain effective, even against defenders who know decoys are a standard tool in the Ukrainian drone playbook. Knowing that a tactic exists and responding effectively to it in the moment are different cognitive challenges. The Russian duty watch officer who directed patrol craft toward the decoy contacts was not ignorant of the concept. He was overwhelmed with simultaneous reporting and made the decision that seemed most urgent in the moment. That's how decoys work. They don't fool you into thinking they're real. They force you to respond to them anyway, because ignoring a contact that might be real is worse than chasing one that turns out to be a decoy. The third lesson, and perhaps the most uncomfortable for Russian defense planners, was about threat normalization. The extended quiet period before the strike was not accidental. Ukrainian planners had deliberately reduced maritime drone activity in the eastern Black Sea in the weeks preceding the operation, specifically to allow Russian alert levels and patrol intensity to drift downward. This is a technique as old as military deception itself, but it worked, which means it will be used again. For Ukraine, the Novorossiysk submarine strike was more than a tactical success. It was a proof of concept that had been building through every previous maritime drone operation. The Black Sea Fleet, once a powerful instrument of Russian naval projection and a constant threat to Ukrainian coastal and inland targets, had been reduced to a fleet in hiding, dispersed across ports that were themselves now proven to be vulnerable. Sevastopol, too dangerous. Novorossiysk, now demonstrated to be penetrable. The fleet that once projected confidence across the Black Sea was conducting its operations with one eye on the harbor entrance at all times, watching for the low profile of a surface drone threading through defenses that might, no matter how many layers were added, contain the one gap that the next wave of operators had already identified. That's not a position of strength. That's the strategic condition that Ukrainian naval operations have imposed on Russia's Black Sea Fleet through sustained, innovative, patient pressure. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. And every innovation compounds the problem for an adversary trying to defend against a threat doctrine that is still being written. The harbor at Novorossiysk has been reinforced since the strike. Additional net barriers. Additional patrol assets. Acoustic detection arrays that Russia's defense procurement rushed to install. A dedicated alert battalion positioned to respond to harbor security incidents at short notice. All of this costs money. All of this costs attention. All of this represents resources diverted from other needs by a military already stretched across a multi-thousand-kilometer front line and a strategic air campaign consuming munitions faster than domestic production can replace them. The submarine at the bottom of its own harbor isn't just a tactical loss. It's an argument, made in steel and salt water, about the direction the Black Sea is moving. And the direction is clear to anyone who has been watching. Ukraine is winning the naval war without a traditional navy. The sea drones prove that. The sunken kilo prove that. And the continuing defensive investments that Russia is being forced to make at every Black Sea facility prove it every single day. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Now, the answer to the question we asked earlier. How many vessels participated in the actual strike package? The answer is B, 6. 3 decoy drones operated on the outer approach, triggering the Russian patrol response and drawing defenders away from the sectors that mattered. 3 strike drones conducted the actual attack, executing coordinated impacts against the submarine's hull in a pattern designed to create flooding faster than pier-side damage control could manage. The decoy-to-strike ratio was deliberately balanced. Enough decoys to create convincing outer harbor activity. Enough strike assets to guarantee hull penetration, even if one drone was lost or suffered a guidance issue in the approach. The decoy drones were engaged and destroyed by Russian patrol craft after completing their diversion task. They were considered expendable from the planning stage. Their mission was to spend themselves drawing Russian attention outward while the strike drones did the work that mattered. 3 questions for the UkraineRadar community to consider. Was reducing the patrol rotation on that evening the single critical failure? Or was the systemic threat normalization across the entire harbor security operation the deeper problem? Could the Black Sea Fleet Command have prevented this outcome by dispersing the submarine to a different facility before the strike window opened? And did they have the intelligence to know they should? What would you have done differently as the harbor security duty officer, with the information available to you in that moment, before the strike began? There's a detail we cut from this breakdown for time. One piece of the operational picture that Ukrainian sources have referenced but not fully confirmed. Comment more if you want us to go deeper on that angle in a follow-up video. The harbor at Novorossiysk is quieter now than it was before, not because the threat has passed, because the threat succeeded, and the ships that remain are moored with a different kind of vigilance. The kind that comes not from confidence, but from fear. The wreck below the surface is still there. It doesn't need to be seen to be felt. Every watch officer on every remaining Black Sea Fleet vessel knows it's there. Silent reminder. Modern warfare punishes overconfidence without mercy. Stay vigilant.